so excited that you're back again with us for another episode of Meet My Mississippi Authors and Artists, and we have another wonderful guest. I always tell you that I love to introduce these people to you, but I love even better for them to introduce themselves. So tell us who you are.
My name is Al Ainsworth. I live in Hernando, Mississippi. I was born and raised in Star, a little town mostly known as Faith Hill's hometown, down in central Mississippi. Moved up here in 1990 and have been here ever since in North Mississippi, and a lifelong Mississippian.
Okay, wonderful. Now tell me, where did you go to school? Where did you go to undergrad? Well, first let's start junior high school. Where did you go to school? People like to connect to our authors and say, oh, I went to school with them. So.
Well, I went to McLaurin High School in its first year of existence, my sophomore year.
Okay.
So it was kind of a new experience where a lot of schools are consolidating. Florence High School split into McLaurin, Florence, and Richland High Schools.
Okay.
And I went to, did my undergraduate work in 5 years at the University of Southern Mississippi. You know, took the victory lap.
Okay.
I majored in coaching and sports administration, and did 3 years worth of student coaching, and got out. I was going to teach English and coach high school baseball, which I did for a while. Now the route to teaching English was a little funny because I had a 7th grade teacher and an 11th grade teacher who were very instrumental in the development of my writing skills, but I didn't know it then.
Okay.
My 7th grade teacher, Miss Ann Knight, tremendous in grammar.
Okay.
I took advanced grammar in college, and it was kind of a review of what Miss Knight taught me in 7th grade.
Oh my goodness.
And then in 11th grade, Miss Leanne Shar, who was only at our school for a few years, really encouraged me to write and saw some things. And I started writing as a 12-year-old, covering sports in a little school near our town.
But so were you writing for the paper or for the...
I was,
okay.
And I've kind of done some of that throughout the years. I've done different types of media for sports.
Okay.
And
how did that come about that a 12-year-old was writing for the paper?
There was a lady in our town who, I don't know why she thought of me, but she did, and I wrote copy, and a lot of it was unedited, went into the paper just like, and then some of it, as a 12-year-old, if the officials make a bad call, you work that into your story, and a good editor knows to remove that. So I learned some of those things along the way. But it was not until probably my 3rd year of college that I decided to teach English.
Okay.
I wanted to be a math teacher. I love solving for X, and I wanted to teach high school math.
Okay.
And I took college algebra, college geometry, college trig, everything was rocking right along. And then I took calculus of the first of 3 classes and decided, maybe something else. So then I thought, well, I'll teach history, but I didn't want to be the coach history teacher that doesn't ever do anything, and just didn't want to go that route. And then I thought, well, people always told me that I should do something with my writing. So I decided to go the English route. Had a great mentor teacher. Matter of fact, we just got together a week or 2 ago and spent some time together for the first time since I left his classroom, and I was able to engage with his writers group, which has been meeting together for 27 years.
Wow. So you work now as an English teacher where?
I'm at North Point Christian School. I work with kids who have learning challenges, so my classes are small. I get to actually spend a lot more time on editing, which is my least favorite part of the writing process, but my students come back to me from college and say that it's invaluable how I was able to teach them the whole process.
And you've used to be my Mississippi children's book.
I do.
I love that.
I'll be honest with you, poetry is not my thing.
A lot of people say that,
well,
but hey, this is different.
But when you can connect things that people know,
exactly.
Or in our case, in our part of the state, our news comes mostly from Memphis. So, being from central Mississippi, having lived in South Mississippi, I love Mississippi, and I still get news from Mississippi, follow it, different writers that I follow. But
most of the kids didn't know half of the stuff.
Less than that. People who grew up in DeSoto County, even adults, I find know very little about Mississippi. So this year, as you've added to your poem, there were some things that I hadn't seen yet. And we got to the part about Viking. And I'm asking my kids because my son played junior college baseball with the owners of Viking, or the people who run Viking, their son. So I knew a little bit more than perhaps most. And so this was one of those days where they were able to use their devices in class. And they're looking it up and they said, well, it's a cooking school. I said, it's more than that.
Yeah,
keep looking.
Right?
Well, there's a little button on their website that you just press the button and it calls. So I had two boys who just decided, one of them decided, I'm going to call and ask them what they do. So he called the number and they answered, and he handed it to the other one and said, here, you talk to them. And so they kind of walked through, we're a high school English class trying to find out about what you do. And the girl who answered the phone said, actually, I'm new here. I've only been here a couple of weeks. Let me hand you off to one of our senior representatives. And she did, and it was obviously a call that they don't get every day.
Right.
But my students got to learn what Viking does, and they were describing some of the kitchen sets that they had. And one of them was a chocolate pie set, and one of the guys looked at me and said, like from The Help. I said, wait.
And you can learn more about Viking if you read the Meet My Mississippi Children's book.
Well, that's right. And but my son's friends' parents were actually in The Help, so I was able to point that out and say the book that I'm writing now, that's just come out, Playing for Overtime. The coach was from Carrollton.
Oh wow!
And one of the houses that they used in The Help is in Carrollton, and I was able to tour it last year. So it was kind of neat to pull together my book with your poem and my English class and relationships and all that. So
go all the way back to starting with your books. That we've talked all about history, so now we're going to talk about your very first book. What was your first book? First of all, I always try to let people know how I met you. I meet the people that I come in contact with and that I interview. We met at the what library?
It was the Olive Branch Library,
and they were doing what, like an author thing. What was
well,
they call that?
it was an author signing.
Okay.
However, they did it at the same time they were having their book sale.
Okay.
So you've got this row of Mississippi authors, and most of them people they've never heard of. Now you had a crowd come in because you had people who knew you. But it was okay. You can either come over and buy this book from these unknown Mississippi, for full price, or you can go buy a John Grisham for a quarter.
Exactly. So we got to talking because I was just so fascinated with your use of technology because I am so computer illiterate. I have a flip phone. I mean, I don't know how to text. I tell people you better call me because I don't know how to text. But you had the most wonderful business cards. You were telling me how, they could scan on here and do this. So that's how we really got to know each other.
Oh, yeah, and I've changed those 3 or 4 times since.
Because you are so you're not techno-challenged. So let's start with the first book, because we've just chatted. We've got so much to chat about. Let's start with the first book, Lines in the Gravel. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, now tell us, you like family storytelling and values. Tell us the background of what you try to do in your books.
I didn't originally start in this direction, but it was one of our family vacations. Now, I've got to give my sister a lot of credit on this. Now, first of all, I've got to say her name is Willa Jean, and she has her own chapter in the book called Willa Jean, bless her heart, because my parents weren't great at naming girls. Now, I'm Alan Wade Ainsworth. My brother is David Andrew Ainsworth. The girls are Lou Ann and Willa Jean. Now, it's bad enough that my second sister's name is Willa Jean, but it's a middle name. So every year when school would start, she would have to answer the roll, and they would call Frances Ainsworth, and she would have to say, no, it's Willa Jean, bless her heart. So anyway, when she graduated college, she and her husband moved to Oklahoma, and they would come back every year at Christmas. It was the only time when the whole family would get together some years. And she always told us that when the kids got a little bit older, they would do Christmas at home at some point. Well, some point has never arrived. Their kids are grown and gone, and they still come home every year. And so that has allowed us to bond as a family. And as the kids, and there were a number of them about the same age, they didn't really click until on into their teenage years. Well, if some of the families had stopped coming or come intermittently during those years, it wouldn't have worked. But several years into that, the kids began to click.
Okay.
And I heard them start telling some of the same stories that we had told all those years.
Okay.
And what I was learning from hearing them tell our stories was that, number one, the most fun we ever had together was when we told the same old stories over and now they might have gotten a little bigger and a little funnier and over the years.
Right.
But for the most part, they were what we did when we got together. And then 2 or 3 years into that, I discovered that they're really not just telling our stories, they're passing down our family values. And so I thought, well, you know, in every story I seemed to come to, my dad had a big part in it.
So tell us about Lines in the Gravel. Where you got the name of this and that story behind it? About going on the school bus or something about lines in the thing?
Well, I found that I tend to come up with a book title and write toward that. You know, you read some of the experts, they'll tell you that that's kind of the last thing you should do is name your book. But for some reason, that comes to me early. And I've talked to other authors who do the same thing. Well, this one of our family stories is the Lines in the Gravel story. And when we were, now understand that I just turned 53, so I have a sister who's 52, one who's 51, and a brother who's 50. So there's not much room between us. Just a year separated us in school by grades. And so we'd go out to the bus in the morning, and being the competitive family that we are, we would get in line, and of course, as the oldest, it's my just desserts to be able to be first in line at the bus. Don't you think?
All right, right.
Well, my brother thought since he was the youngest and everything was unfair to him that he should always be first in the line. Well, my sisters are endowed with an incredible sense of fairness, and they didn't see any fairness in either one of those scenarios. So every morning we'd go out to stand and wait for the bus, and it'd be a fight every day about who got to be first in line and who had to be last and all that. So after some time, my mom got sick of all that, and she had to call an intervention. So she came up with a plan. She had a chart, and on Mondays, that was my day to be first in line. But after my day to be first in line, I had to rotate to the back of the line. And being 4 of us, Fridays tended to be, you know, another deal altogether.
Right.
So I don't remember how that worked out. I don't remember how holidays worked out.
Okay.
But essentially, we came to some agreement, and, you know, once we got that major ordeal settled, then we could get down to minor things like, you know, getting an education and trying to make a difference in the world. So it was stories like that, though, that kind of passed down the values of when it was time for mom and dad to intervene.
Where did that come from?
Well, when we stood in line for the bus and when we had gotten our chart worked out, then every day we'd walk out there, and whoever was first would kind of mark out their spot in the gravel, and that would be their place for the day. And so, you know, somebody driving the bus would turn the corner, and all they would see is 4 kids waiting on the bus. But if you looked a little bit closer, you saw those lines in the gravel that were just kind of symbolic of the family harmony that mom's intervention had caused. And there were so many stories like that. We had 25 ribbons at Christmas time that I call Lines in the Gravel Revisited, because, you know, 25 days to Christmas, who's going to undo the ribbon for that day? So we had to come up with turns for that. And then I think it was every 4th year you got to undo the ribbon for Christmas Day.
Oh my goodness. So y'all need to read this Lines in the Gravel, because so many family stories. And it helps us to think about the stories in our families that you can write about. The next book in the series, right, is Stories from the Roller Coaster of a Faith Life. Stories from the Roller Coaster of a Faith Life. Is that your second book?
That's my second book.
Okay, now tell us just a little bit about that.
Well, the first book ended with my salvation story. It was after the death of a good friend of mine that was just a key point for me that I feel like moved me from childhood to adulthood.
Okay.
And this kind of picks up the story from that point, and takes you through some of the oddball moments of my faith journey. I was going to be the guy who went to one school, coached there for 40 years, did a great job in the classroom, and taught and coached young men and then their sons and then their great-grandsons won multiple state championships, and impacted generations of young men. But I've never stayed at a job more than 8 years, and it just wasn't the Lord's plan for my life. And so this is a lot of the stories of faith moves that I would never recommend anybody to take unless God said.
And tell us about the Coach Day series, season 1, and why did you start a series of this?
Well, I've done a lot of different things regarding the game of baseball. Grew up reading the box scores as a kid. 6 years old, reading the box scores in the paper. Grew up going to the Jackson Mets games, the AA games in Jackson, and after a lifetime or a career as a coach, and as a baseball dad, I've got 2 sons who played ball from T-ball on up. One's playing college ball now, and the other one's still in high school. I've been my favorite dalliance into the whole baseball business has been some time as a color commentator at first, and now play-by-play man for Lewisburg High School, where my boys go to school. And that's been a lot of fun. So I've been a part of the game in so many different ways. I could write a book about everything there is wrong with youth baseball today, but I decided to go a different direction because there is a whole lot of good that's going on in sports as well. And
because you hear the bad stories of people,
Sure,
parents fighting and all that
and
kind of stuff.
all that's valid. I mean,
Right.
I remember asking you, why don't you write about the bad stuff? Why are you all positive Mississippi all the time? And you said, there's plenty of people who write about that.
Absolutely.
I'm here for the good stuff.
Yep.
And so I decided to go in that direction because it kind of fits into what I believe is the core of what I write, family, story, and legacy. And I believe some of the better baseball stories have happened because players, parents, and coaches got on the same page with one another and trusted one another enough to make some decisions that maybe they didn't understand. And what you're going to find in this series are people that you see around the ballpark all the time. Probably my favorite character is a guy named Rooster. There's always that guy who speaks first, thinks later, and just says whatever's on top of his mind and carries around some kind of nickname, like the 300-pound guy nicknamed Tiny.
Right.
Well, Rooster is just kind of a character who is like that, and it takes him a while, but he gets it. Over the course of the 5 books in the series, he gets it. And what we see is a group of dads whose sons start off playing recreational baseball, and they move to the second season is All-Stars. And one of my colleagues at school read that and he said, you've got every caricature of All-Star baseball in here for every year that his son played. He said, there's always that kid who quits because he's not getting enough playing time.
Right.
Parents don't give the coach long enough to figure out who needs to be playing where and that kind of thing. And so they walk through that season, and always on the other side of it is the win-at-all-cost coach. And along about the 3rd book is when they go to middle school, and you start seeing some of the results of his overcoaching his own son, of his pitching his own son too much. And he has an arm injury, and dad continues to pitch him. And it's at that point that my sister pointed out, she was one of my beta readers for the books, and she said, I kind of like Hunter Brand. And I'd heard one of the podcasts that I listened to. For you writers out there, the Story Grid podcast has been tremendous for me in learning how to build an inciting incident, a middle build, and an ending payoff for different books, chapters, and scenes. And so I got to thinking, that podcast suggests that the first thing you think of, the way you solve a problem, is the way that is too cliche. So as I began to work through that, I said, well, what would happen if this kid weren't the typical result of what happens when you're overcoaching a kid? What if there was another way? And it was at that point that the character started to take over. And their character that I had built, the world that I had built around them through the first 2 to 3 books, started to take over, and they started telling me where they wanted to go.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's when it gets so much fun.
So many writers say that.
I would sit down and they do, and I heard one of the authors that you interviewed saying that, and I'm like, yes, me too.
Yes.
I would sit down at the coffee shop, and one of the things that I do as a writing practice to make myself go, and also to make myself not sit down at a computer for 3 hours so that I can get
Right,
up and
right.
don't feel like sitting down again for days.
Right.
I'll set a timer for 25 minutes.
Okay.
At the end of that, my goal is to get up and move around for 5 minutes and get back to it. I would set the timer, and it was like the story started writing
Wow,
itself.
I've
And I
heard
love
this.
it.
I love
Well,
that.
what this young man does is he finds a way to be on Coach Dave's team, even to the point where in season 4, the climactic, the big game has always got to come at the end of a sports book.
Right.
He is actually pitching against his dad's team.
Oh my goodness.
And the ending there too, it's one that you can predict it as you read it, but it's good anyway.
Oh my goodness.
And so that goes through travel ball, which I
Okay.
know is really big in Mississippi.
Okay.
And then the final season is their 8th grade year of middle school, their 2nd year of middle school ball, where they are playing for a championship, but at the same time, they're moving from playing with each other to the very next day competing against each other at high school tryouts.
Okay.
And so that's kind of where the series ends, but I couldn't end it there because those characters have become near and dear to me
Right.
and to my readers. And so there is a last chapter
Okay.
of 10 years later, where are they now? And
Okay.
that was so much fun to write,
Loved
but the
it.
characters were so hard to let go of.
So y'all have got to get all of the Coach Dave series 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Well, and the hard part about the series is who is it written for?
Okay.
And-
Everybody.
and
Coaches, people who love baseball, who love sports, Father's Day gifts.
Well, and I was doing a podcast interview with Craig Hayworth, who does a podcast called Winning Youth Coaching, and he hit the nail on the head. He said, "I'm going to get this and read it with my son," and I said, "That is the home run is that players, parents, or coaches would get this and read it.
Absolutely.
The grand slam is parents and their kids reading this book together."
Absolutely. So y'all hear that? It's perfect for all ages and parents and coaches and dads and sons and dads and daughters and all of that. So we would love this. Okay, your next book now is what? After the series, you started on this big project.
Well,
Tell us about how that came.
you're supposed to write in one genre where someone like I know what Carl Purden writes, for example. I know you interviewed him, and if you ask him, well, what do you write? Well, he writes mystery novels.
Right.
Mine is a little bit different because my first 2 books were memoirs, and then I did a middle grade coaching or sports series, and now this one is an adult biography.
Okay.
And this is a story that I first heard in 1988. I was on the 5-year plan at college, like I said, and I came home one fall. My goal was to coach baseball, but I loved all other sports too. My mom, totally not a sports fan unless Roger Staubach's Dallas Cowboys were playing back in the day.
Okay.
And she handed me an article she had clipped out of the paper, back when you would clip it rather than
Right.
click it. And it was about a coach in Tishomingo, Mississippi, who had called a play at the end of a game that just made national news. And his team was, they had to win by 4 to make the playoffs. And they were ahead by 2. They had the ball at the 35-yard line and time for one more play. Couldn't kick a field goal that far. Not a real good chance that they were going to score a touchdown if they tried, the long pass, because the coach's son was the quarterback, converted tight end, couldn't throw the ball that far. He was a big old boy, and I didn't believe it until I watched the game film. Yeah, you're right. You probably couldn't throw it 35 yards. And so then there was a third option. It was one that I think somebody in the stands had suggested to the coach. Now, the coach wasn't on the sidelines as you would normally think during a ball game, because a year earlier he had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And he was coaching from the back of a flatbed truck that was off the sidelines a little bit to protect him. And he was at about the 35-yard line, and he sent it in. He knew with about 40-something seconds to go that if his team didn't score, this was what they were going to do. And so they took a couple of delay of games trying to get the play just right. And eventually they turned and threw the ball and tossed it back to their running back, who was the fastest player on the team. And he took it 55 yards in the other direction for a safety to tie the game as time expired, send the game into overtime. They were able to stop the other team, score a touchdown, win by 6, and make the playoffs.
Wow.
And it blew up.
Everywhere.
And I thought, man, what a story. Well, my mom was interested in the story because she had gone to high school with Coach David Lee Herbert, originally from Carrollton, Mississippi.
Okay.
And I kept that clipping for the longest time. Have no idea where it is now, but sometime after 2005, Coach Herbert had passed away out of an extremely long battle with ALS. Typically, you're diagnosed 3 to 5 years.
Right.
He lived for 18, and it's a fantastic story behind that. You have to read the book
Definitely
for all that.
read the book.
It's hard to get into
And
so
what's the
much
name
of
of
it.
the book? Say the name of
The book is called Playing for Overtime,
Okay.
the David Lee Herbert story. And it's
Okay.
one of those that I didn't have a title right off. I knew it had to be something with overtime because that was, I go back and forth between the game and his personal life. And in the game, he was playing for overtime, but in life, he lived, 13 years past his diagnosis. And so he didn't just exist, he lived. And there was so much behind that his wife is such a hero in this story as well. But they had worked out a system of communication that one of the nurses who had voluntarily driven 2 hours each way every 3 months or so to change out his breathing tube, she made the comment that I thought was one of the most pointed in all my research. She said, even laying there in his hospital bed, he was more of a man of the house than most able-bodied men. And so there was kind of that dual playing for overtime. And just,
So overall, tell us what you want readers to get from Al Ainsworth's books and from your writing, and what is your message overall, and give us your website and where to find you, and Twitter, Instagram, all that.
okay, well, my books center around family, story, and legacy. So I think that opens it up for me to write from different genres as long as it's centered there. And so this book, again, a great example of, first of all, a great football story, but then beyond that, one of the articles that I read said that it was, the national reporters got the game story, but they missed the story behind the story.
And there you come in.
And I've always felt like that was something. And Rick Cleveland is the Hall of Fame sports writer, just one of the best ever. And he and I met a few years ago, and he said he felt like the family would want their story told. Rick actually wrote the foreword for this, did a tremendous job. He said he felt like every football game for a small school like Tishomingo was like each one was a passion play in and of itself. And he covers all those games from the sideline, not from the booth. And so as I got deeper into that story, I saw it really fit, first of all, from a family standpoint, from a story standpoint, but the legacy I didn't really get until I knew there was a legacy in his family. But when I talked to his former players and saw the impact that he's still having in their lives 30, 35 years later, that's when I found the depth of this story. And Tishomingo, Mississippi today is different because an all-shucks football coach moved his family in there and invested in these kids as their own. And black, white, it didn't matter, just like his childhood. Grew up playing with the black kids who lived behind him, playing football with rolled up socks on the courthouse lawn. And moved to Tishomingo. The one thing they'll say about him over and over again is how fair he was, that you were going to get a shot with him, and it didn't matter whether you were black, white, or green, that he saw you all as people. And I watch young men now who are different races, but lifelong friends. And so much of that goes back to Coach Herbert's influence.
So give us your website, Instagram, tell us, where to find you on Twitter, tell them, look at Karen.
Well, I probably got a little bit too wide when I first started writing, but my website is alainsworth.com. Everything points to Amazon. I do a lot of work on my Amazon author page, so if you just search Amazon Al Ainsworth author, it'll take you to all that. It connects to my blog and all that. My books are available through, I always say this, my books are available through Amazon or out of the trunk of my car.
Right.
I've always got one I'm willing to sell you out of the trunk of my car.
Yeah, he's got one.
That's the life of an independent author.
Absolutely. So we want everybody to get these books, and tell us, you also have businesses tell their stories, so they can get in contact with you to help with branding because you're telling their story.
Right, that's something I don't do a lot of, but I absolutely love to do. I listen to a lot of marketing podcasts for bigger companies that tell their stories. The last 2 presidential elections were won on stories that people could connect with. You've got big brands, for instance, like Home Depot that says, you can do it, we can help. Well, that takes the fear out of going to the lumber yard away from the homeowner who just wants to do a little project. And so it's story, though, that helps people connect with that. And I found that in small businesses in particular, you get so caught up in the day-to-day that you forget about the big picture of your story. And so that's something that small businesses can't afford the big operations that do that, but if you just get somebody to help you tell your story, and how to share that on social media and all, it goes a long way toward people connecting with you.
So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for telling these stories and the legacy and helping us to think about creating our legacies and talking about them and writing about them, so you can encourage a lot of people with that.
Well, I just want to say to your audience too that maybe you write a book with your family stories, or maybe you just sit down in front of a video recorder and just tell some of your best stories. And intentionally tell those over and over again, because you'll be amazed at how many of your family values will get lost by you not telling your stories, and how many of those get passed down by intentionally telling your stories.
And that's how we got to be friends, because that was the main gist of my poems and my books, to tell stories and to tell people to tell your stories. And I've got so many of my stories in my poems. So again, thank you all for coming again to Meet My Mississippi, authors and artists. We have so many wonderful guests lined up for you on the Hill Country Network. See you next time.
It's inside me, girl, it's in the air. It's who I am through and through. It won't take long till it gets to you. It's everywhere. Mississippi magic is sweet molasses breeze. God, country, family, that's what it means to me. Mockingbirds and bumblebees, magnolia